Stewardship Program. Little did I know at the time, he was later to call me up and ask me to come speak this morning about stewardship. I know that I might not have bought his breakfast that day. In all seriousness, though, I'm happy to have the opportunity to be here this morning and talk to you about giving, because it's a subject I have some strong feelings about. Another confession this morning. I always remember in seminary we had services 3 times a day, and at least one time a semester, whoever the worship team was would use the wrong lessons. Father Thomas sent me the lessons for yesterday, and they're also today, which we celebrated last Tuesday. So I actually prepared a message based on Matthew 23. Which I had a difficult time to some extent trying to figure that into a stewardship sermon. So we'll see how that goes. But let me read to you the first few verses of Matthew 23. Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sat on Moses' seat, therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. Who do not do as they do, but they don't practice what they teach." He was referring to the religious leaders. Now, I'm going to take some poetic license here this morning and suggest that Jesus would direct each of you to do whatever the priest or canon teaches you to do. That's certainly poetic license. But then our congregations, if they did all that our clergy suggested, we wouldn't need sermons about giving, because everybody would already be practicing good stewardship. We preachers, whenever possible, though, like to attempt to focus our sermons around the lessons designed for each Sunday. That's not always easy, as was the case this morning. Just one verse out of all that. For some time now, Jesus had been facing off with the religious leaders who were determined to bring about Jesus' downfall and destroy the impact and influence that he was having on the people as he moved around the city of Jerusalem during his last days before he would be condemned to death on the cross. Jesus had offered numerous parables that were meant to draw attention to the fact that the religious leaders were failing those who they were meant to lead by refusing to recognize God's Son who was in their very midst. This morning we have the last of our teachings that were directed to the religious leaders during Jesus' last days on earth. Jesus was on the attack, and he had compared the elders earlier to a rebellious son, or a group of wicked tenant farmers, or the condemned guest of the wedding banquet. They had challenged his authority, and he had told them that the tax collectors and the prostitutes would enter into heaven before they would. Their plan had been to discredit Jesus in front of the people, but their attempts repeatedly failed. 2 weeks ago, we read another question being posed to Jesus by the religious leaders. Now, we need to remember that the Jews were subject to the laws of the Roman Empire. And what was that question? Who remembers 2 weeks ago? They came and they said, is it lawful or not to pay taxes to the emperor? Is it right to pay tribute to Rome? We can also see that the people of the time thought about taxation about the same way we do, right? It's my money. Why should I give it to the government? Or maybe even the church. The question that the Pharisees asked could have created a real dilemma for Jesus, and that's exactly what they had intended it to do. Is it lawful to pay tribute to Rome? Now, if Jesus declared that it was unlawful, then the religious leaders would have probably reported to the Roman authorities and accused him of sedition, and he would have been immediately arrested. However, if Jesus claimed that it was lawful, then he'd find himself discredited in the eyes of many people. The whole thing was meant to create a no-win situation for Jesus. No matter how he answered, someone was going to be offended. The Jewish people, God was not only their king, but to be forced to pay taxes to an earthly king and to admit his authority and kingship over them was an insult to their God. And in the eyes of a Jew, to have to pay any tax to a foreign power was just simply wrong. So you see what the dilemma was. I suspect most of you are familiar with the dialogue that took place that day, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. Other than to say that Jesus reminded the people that they were sinners of earthly abode and citizen of heaven, and as such they owed both their right due. Prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the people were required to pay a tax, a temple tax. Those represented the funds that were used to maintain the temple and support the priest. The temple tax was paid with a special coin that was minted by the temple for that specific purpose. Now, when Jesus had run the money changers out of the temple only days before, what were those men doing? They were exchanging Roman worship at his Father's house. Matthew tells his readers that Jesus saw what was taking place, and he took a Roman coin with Caesar's face on it and said, "Give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is his." Jesus acknowledged that we owe our government for the services and provisions that they provide, those things that we'd be unable to provide for ourselves. And Jesus would also remind us this morning that we are to be good citizens of our country and the kingdom of God as well. Poor Caesar. He'd stamped his image on a piece of metal and he thought that he owned it. That coin was a symbol of his own self-delusion, that he owned and controlled about everything. Jesus said that Caesar may own that coin. He did have his picture on it. That's about all that Caesar could really lay claim to. In the book of Genesis, we're told that God stamped his image on you and me. We're reminded that we each are created in God's image. So when Jesus told the people, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and render unto God that which is God," that message should be really clear to each of us here this morning. When someone mentions the word stewardship or pledge drive, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Money. The church wants my money. Well, that's partially true, but it's so much more than that. That's what I want to take a few moments to talk about this morning. So let's begin by defining what stewardship is. How do you describe a steward? A steward is someone who looks after someone else's property. That's what a ship steward does. He or she is responsible for the property and the well-being of the passengers on the ship. We used to call flight attendants stewardesses when someone decided that was politically incorrect. But by either task, the job is the same. You have to look after the needs of others. They're responsible for making decisions that may have an impact on those they serve. And the Bible, a steward was often a servant who was responsible for looking after the possessions of their master. A steward was appointed to that position of responsibility by his master. So who can tell me who was the first steward mentioned in the Bible? Adam. God created all things, and then he turned all creation over to Adam and charged him with the responsibility of caring for God's new creation. He was God's first steward. He was responsible for God's possessions. Noah was made a steward over God's creatures prior to the flood. Joseph was the chief steward of Pharaoh's court, and it was through his efforts that his brothers against the Jewish people were saved during the famine. Moses was called to be God's steward over the Israelites to lead them out of captivity in Egypt. And in each instance, God passed on responsibility for a part of creation to someone else and gave them the ability to look after them. But in each instance, God was there to lead and guide them. He was there to give them instructions. In the end, he would give them their reward. He merely called them to be good, responsible stewards of his possessions. Do you remember that? We have a couple of times where Jesus used one of his parables about stewards to make a point. I remember the story of the three servants. The master was about to go away, and he called three of his servants in, and he gave each one a different amount according to their ability, and then he went away. The master would later return and call for an accounting. Now, two of the servants had invested wisely. They had doubled their master's money, while the last one had buried it because he was afraid. The master rewarded the two who had used their master's money wisely, but he called the last servant crazy and useless and had him thrown out in the darkness. Trust me, one wants to be seen as useless in God's eyes because he failed to be a faithful steward. God was attempting to teach his followers that they were to use their gifts that they had received from God wisely, and that they would be judged accordingly. Now let's take our discussion a little further. We can't really talk about stewardship without talking about tithing. I remember my congregation at St. James several years ago came and told me that since Jesus didn't talk anything about tithing in the New Testament, that he just assumed that was an Old Testament teaching and didn't have anything to do with New Testament Christians. Wrong. The Old Testament is filled with references to people bringing their tithes and offerings to God. So when I found nearly 20 instances where Jesus talked about giving in the New Testament, I think it's easy to look at Jesus' words when he told the people that he came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. I believe he's reminding the people that they knew exactly what was expected of them in the Old Testament, and nothing had changed for the New Testament followers of Christ. It is interesting to note that the majority of our mainline churches encourage their people to tithe, even though many don't. As a youngster, I grew up in the Baptist church. My folks wrote their first check following payday every month as their offering to the church. It was always a tithe. And I was taught to give a dime of my dollar allowance each week as well. I always felt that they saw their giving, not really so much giving to the church, but rather returning to God something that had been his to begin with. In our worship service, I quite often use the offertory sins ascribed before the honor of his name, bring offerings coming to his Lord. You see, I believe that our offerings are just that. They're our way of honoring the God who provides for our every need. You see, God doesn't need your money. I'm sorry I said that, Brother Thomas. But you see, I believe that God is the master of the universe, and his will be done in spite of our actions. But you see, you and I need to give back to God a portion of what he is and has been given us, in thanksgiving and recognition for all that he does. The scripture says that we're to use our gifts wisely, that we'll be judged accordingly. It was Martin Luther who said, I've held many things in my hand, and I've lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I shall ever possess. Now, I'll never accept the concept of the teaching of the prosperity teachers. I don't believe that when we give to God that he's going to fill our every desire. You're not going to get that new job or be healed from some ailment because you're giving to the church. You see, I believe that God is prepared to fulfill our every need. You heard I said need, not necessarily desire. He does that because he loves us, not because we're bribing with our offerings. I've mentioned on numerous times in the past that we're called to give of our time and our talent and our possessions, and I've always followed that statement by saying that's not multiple choice. We're to exercise patience in dealing with God, allowing him to work things in his time, not ours. We're to use our God-given talents in the service of others, and we're to manage our possessions wisely. James reminded his readers that every good and perfect gift comes from God. And Jesus reminds his followers that we're to give from a grateful heart. God knows if you don't want to give, or if giving back to God doesn't give you a sense of joy, then for Pete's sake, don't give. I said it again. But I mean it. We begin our service each week with the words, you all hearts are open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hid. Someone said once that we should give until it hurts, and I always said, no. We need to give until it feels good. Until it gives us a sense of joy that we can give something back to God. That can only happen when we stop and think about why we give. Sure, we got to pay the bills. We've got to maintain this place of worship. Like it or not, we got to pay Brother Thomas and give the way we can, and it drops about to do a service from time to time. But your offering should always reach beyond the doors into the community. pretty significant building programs here in 15 years. And when I left there 6 years ago, we were debt free. Now, we weren't able to do that because we had any wealthy parishioners, believe me, or an endowment or any grants outside the church. When we built our first worship space, our average attendance was 14 people. We borrowed $100,000 and we paid that hotel for 3 years. Our people have shared the congregation. For 20 years, they've met in various homes with the dream that one day they'll have their own worship space. People shared that version. And we put a sign out in a vacant lot that said, "Moving forward in faith." People said, "What's that mean?" I said, "Well, just wait and see." We adopted a vision statement that said, "Looking up, reaching out, and gathering in." It was kind of short and sweet, but I believe it said volumes. It meant that we knew where our vision came from, and we were looking up. And it stated our desire to be a meaningful presence within our community. We were reaching out. And it told everyone that our purpose was to grow and gather in the church within our community. I've often talked about giving and tithing without using those words so much, but I never fail to pass up the opportunity to remind people that it really wasn't about giving, but rather about returning back to God a portion of what He's given us. People say, "James, learn to place their trust in God and to give their offering with a thankful heart," and those people have been blessed in so many ways. Your giving will never bring you joy as long as you simply see it as paying bills rather than furthering God's kingdom and acknowledging that all we have comes from Him. You a giver? Or are you giving with a thankful heart? Are you a tither? If you're a typical Episcopalian, you're probably not. And I'm not suggesting that you begin to give 10% of your income beginning with this pledge drive, although I would discourage that. But I would challenge you to establish that as your goal. Whatever you're currently giving today, increase that amount by 1 or 2% of your income this coming year. And then do the same thing each year until you reach your goal. God calls for a tithe, and that should be each of our goals. But before you even consider doing anything, spend some serious time in prayer. Acknowledge and thank God for all the blessings that you've received in the past, and then tell Him what it is that you want to do in the future with giving. Share your plan with God and ask Him to support you in that commitment. While giving certainly has a lot to do with dollars and cents, about keeping the doors of the church open and paying the bills, what it is truly about is how each of us sees our relationship with God. It's about saying thank you to God in a meaningful way. God's Son paid the ultimate price to save you and me on the cross of Calvary. How do you ever repay that debt? We can't. But we can certainly attempt to take steps in that direction by the way we return to God a portion of what was already His to begin with. Your approach to giving to God that portion that He rightly deserves is between you and God. But the day may come when your Mass of Christ's sacrifice meant so little that you could express your love for Him through your offering to the church and the ministry in a meaningful way. Think hard about how you might want to answer that question. And then I challenge you in the days ahead to make a commitment to increase your current giving. You will never be able to give back to God what He's given to you. Like it or not, your giving is an outward visible sign of your love for God. It expresses your desire to be a part of the ongoing mission of the church. So attempt to